Hey everybody, so I'm going to talk a little bit about scale today, and it is our kind of our last detailed um, component of BURPM. And remember that BURPM was our acronym for how do we create unity, that's the U, balance, unity, rhythm, proportion, and scale, emphasis, and motion. And how do we combine all of those to create unity into a composition? So the last one I want to think about is scale. And how do we actually use that? Um, I've given you a link related to this Powers of 10, which is an incredible kind of to me, it's kind of mind blowing when you think about scale in terms of things making really, really, really big and things really, really, really small. And so there's just a film, it's 9 minutes long, done in the late 60s, early 70s, of the relative sizes of things in the universe, which to me is fascinating, right? So check that out, please. That's the first thing that we talk about. Is done by a husband and wife team of designers who built things, and this was one of their tools that they used. So check that out. And whoops. And when we think about scale, we think about relative size. And relative size means in comparison to something else. And that could be the page, it could be other visual elements, it could be in terms of where it is in the world, where it's posted. Okay, so I'm going to mention a few things related to the next project, the last project that we're working on, and how do you think about your social issue in terms of scale? Because you're doing it in something small. Your output is something on a social media platform as well as on a billboard or bus stop. So how are you going to use those two? Okay, combine them that way. So what's big and what's small and what's referring to is relative. And so what are some of the tools that we can use? And it may be something simple like size or placement or color around it to think about scale. Okay, so even as things are on the page, if they're the same size and same color, there's not much difference, right? So we want to create this play of scale, can give us a hierarchy as well. And then using, again, safe in the center versus pushing us off the edges. But how do we create that structure so that we can get some scale? Okay, and this has been used a lot in art and built a lot on art, but its relation to people is a big component. If it's something that we hold in our hands versus something we see hanging, something that is meant for large masses, something that is meant for grab your attention right away, instant impact, versus something that's maybe a little bit smaller that we have to dig into. Okay, so you might see the Mona Lisa here on the right. It's kind of just a different approach, not our typical way of seeing the Mona Lisa painting, kind of a play of that. This painting is actually 6 feet by 5.5 feet ish, compared to the original painting hundreds of years ago, and how small it actually is, right? So here's another way of thinking about it. You see this figure in front of the pyramids, and in this proportion or this scale, you see her is pretty much bigger than the actual pyramids. So that's one context. You see a figure in the background already in the right hand side, and that figure is pretty small because it's comparing to everything else. But if we look at the pyramids in this context, in this scale, maybe which one's better? Compare it to the cars along the left or the buildings along the background, and proximity of these pyramids relation to others. It's amazing to think about it actually, if assuming there's no editing done to this photo, how close the city is to these pyramids, right? So you're thinking about scale of something compared to something else, the world around it, the elements nearby, that kind of thing. Okay. We can also think about things that are seen again from a farther distance. So a higher scale, how do we look at that and see what's done in a field. This was done several hundred years ago in South America, and what people would see when they walk around were just some paths. But you actually look at it from the sky, and it's the spider, and it's actually 150 feet tall, long, not tall. So it's this idea of scale and comparing it to something else, but seeing it from a different point of view is fascinating, right? So on the flip side of it, you don't need to actually respond, but how big do you think this is? Or what do you see first, and then how big do you think it is? Well, we need to give it some kind of context to actually pay attention to scale. So here's that context. Now we know how small that dollar bill actually is. So maybe you want to think about how big things are versus how small they are. But again, we start to recognize things just based on how far away we are from them. It grabs our attention. If you know what that is, it's the Firefox logo. Okay. So consider size and scale when you're doing it. Okay. And by that, I mean, think about where it's placed, think about composition, think about placement, think about nearness, think about how you want the viewer to feel, right? Do you want people to feel positive or negative? Do you want them to feel like they can breathe? Do you want to feel like there's chaos or that there's no space? Okay, so explore that a little bit when you're thinking about how would this work in terms of your social advocacy or your social issue, how you can use scale in your solutions. But you can put things centered and safe, you can make things really big, you can make things really small. How does that change the experience of the person viewing it? So if you go into this building, this cathedral, how do you feel? You might feel small. You might feel that you are just a small component in life. You might feel that it's not comfortable, that you need to pay attention, right? So you might have these associations with this kind of environment, but where you're the small, you're not compared to everything else. And then flip that to this kind of environment. Do you feel different? Probably. It's a smaller room, there's more comfortable seats, the lighting is different. You think about the structure of the ground and the walls, it feels different, right? Because of the use of scale. Compare that to something like this. That is Dr. J, if you know and you think about the 76ers back in the day, one of the best basketball players, of all time. But again, you have a comparison between actual humans down at the bottom, comparing them that way. Versus this, again, people running, this illustration of them, but we wouldn't know how big they are unless we compared them to the cars going by. See it quickly. Okay, here's another painting. You think about the use of space and scale and proportion that way. It kind of feels open. It kind of feels like there's breathing room for people. Different composition here, but it completely feels different. People are closer together. It's instead of having the space between shoulders, shoulder to shoulder, you think about everybody's face is close to one another. They're able to put their arms around each other. And think about your life now. Maybe that changes your interpretation of this particular same subjects, but a different placement of elements. Okay, but this use of scale and proportion can work in our design. It can help draw attention to something, even if it's not exactly the right size. For example, just using repetition on the left might get you some notice of those are a little bit big, or the hands on the right. Again, repetition there with some variety, but we get this idea of that's what I'm drawn to. And the one on the right, they're leading the hands to the text too. Okay, but you might go with something that's exaggerated as well. You might create this idea of confusion or the use of surrealism in show you an example of that in a second. But we look at this fly on the right, and you're like, I feel completely different about the fly, comparing it to a fly that I would see in real life, where it's like smaller than my hand. Gives you different emotion related to that. Similarly, I just said of surrealism on the right there, Magritte would have done that with a comb and a brush and a cup, and those feel bigger than normal, right? On the left, if you've ever seen a great movie, Honey, I Shrunk the kids are tiny. So you're seeing them in proportion of, or in relationship to, the actual size and how that works. Okay. In Scotland, we drove by these, and you can see these horses for miles away because they are just absolutely huge. And again, they're huge scale, and you can compare it in the background. Now that car is parked, and it may not be directly close, but that car is parked, and you compare it to the size, and you can see how big these kelpies are, these horses. Just a use of scale versus this, right? And so your exploration of depth and use of space, and it looks like this dinosaur is actually going to eat these people or attack these people, but how far away are the actual people? But this is used a lot in design, this idea of small versus big versus, that proportion, comparing two elements in relationship to each other, right? So you can use to your advantage, if you want to explore in this project related to photography, use something like a chessboard piece and one of those little dogs that is not big, maybe an inch wide. Gives you some interesting scale. Or you use something like, how can you take something that is incredibly small but move your camera closer? Good comparison of these, just the exploration of scale in your projects. Okay, so that kind of wraps up our last Burpham: balance, unity, rhythm, proportion, emphasis, and motion. How do we use those? Just something to consider as you are looking at, for this project. Again, you're creating either a billboard or a bus shelter composition, and that same composition in a social media platform. So how would you play with that idea of scale for this project?